All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm glad you guys came. I know in the middle of the pandemic, we're all kind of freaky about your contact, but we can see we've got nice little pods. So Theytus Books, publishing Indigenous voices, 40 years of Theytus Books. Our name means preserving for the sake of handing down. Okay, so I'd like to start with acknowledgement of the land. We acknowledge and respect that this land is the traditional and unceded territory of the Insilchin-speaking people, the Syilx, the Okanagan, who have resided here since time immemorial and will continue, hopefully, to do so for many generations to come. And if you can see, the Okanagan territory in Canada goes way up, and Penticton, I believe, we're just this little dot here. Let me use my laser pointer. There we are. So one of the first things that I would like to teach you guys is how to say hello in Insilchin. Can everybody say why? Why? Okay, that means hello. That means hello in the language. It's always good to hear the language on the land, and it's always good to know just that one little word gets you in the door. So Theytus Books was founded in 1980 in Nanaimo by Randy Fred, who had a vision of an Indigenous-owned and controlled publishing house that would produce culturally appropriate Indigenous books. Theytus Books Limited was officially incorporated as a limited company in Victoria on January 21st, 1981, and became the first Indigenous-owned and operated book publishing company in the world. Theytus was purchased by the Okanagan Indian Resources Society in 1982 and was moved to the Announcement Center in Penticton B.C. However, the company has never strayed from Fred's vision in its 47 years of operations that has seen the publication of over 200 titles under our flagship. In its first decade, Theytus was a small regional publisher focusing mostly on Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, publishing 1 to 2 books per year with distribution only in BC and Alberta by Sandhill Distributors. Theytus Books organized the historical Aboriginal Publishers Conference in 1994 with the Canada Council and Department of Canadian Heritage, hosted by Simon Fraser University. Over 30 Indigenous publishers from Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Central and South America attended. It was at this conference that Theytus realized that it was the first Indigenous publisher in the world. Theytus is regarded by Indigenous authors in the industry as one of the most important Indigenous publishers and an example for other upcoming publishers. As a member in good standing with the Association of Canadian Publishers, the Literary Press Group, and the Association of Book Publishers of BC, Theytus now attends all meetings of these important organizations and provides an Indigenous voice in the industry. Theytus has also taken a lead role in the reconciliation movement in Canada and throughout the publishing industry. Theytus solicits works from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis creators from all regions in Canada. We support the works of emergent authors. The majority of our works have been several short story collections, novels, nonfiction, and children's picture books and short story books. Many of our books include sections in Indigenous languages in support of language preservation and education. This one is Zoey and the Fawn, which is also in Insilchin. Bear's medicine is actually in the Dalek language, which is our northern cousins. Louis Riel Day is the Fur Trade Project, so it's more of like a historical book for children. The Girl and the Wolf by Catherine Vermette, and the illustrations are by Julie Flett, has been winning awards, and it's an amazing story of resilience of the little girl who gets lost in the woods, and the wolf teaches her that she has enough strength to carry on. The Blueberry Patch is also in the native language of Anishinaabe, which is the language of the author Jennifer Lawrence. Why we care about who writes histories, and why we care about who writes our stories. Why we have tried our best to record and share histories and stories. Case in point is the residential school experience in Canada. The Kamloops Indian Residential School was part of the Canadian residential school system, established as part of the government's policy of forced assimilation that resulted in the oppression of generations of Indigenous children. It was one of more than 130 such schools that operated in Canada between 1874 and 1996. When Indigenous communities speak of intergenerational traumas of residential schools, they're referring to the near ambiguous Indigenous experience of growing up around parents who had spent their formative years being denied love and subjugated to the constant risk of violence or abuse. This is one of the, this is one of the 7 grandfather teachings, which is central in healing the new generations that are coming up. So this is actually not in Silchin, this is from the Cree Nation. So we have the north, which is the mind and intellectual, the east, which is the spiritual, the south, which is the emotional, and the west, which is the physical. All 4 of these components are in each person and is part of the healing process that we all have to do as individuals. Children were forcibly removed from their homes once attendance became mandatory by law in the 1920s, with their parents under threat of prison if they refused. Students lived at the school from September to June, alienated from their family except for Christmas and Easter visits. And this one gets me hard because it's in the 1940s, and it says, "It will be your privilege this year to have your children around Christmas with you." For me, it hits emotionally because my mom was a residential school survivor, and my grandfathers and my great-grandfathers going all the way back into the 1860s. So intergenerational trauma, sometimes referred to as transgenerational trauma, is a term that is used to describe the impact of a traumatic experience, not only on one generation, but on subsequent generations after the event. Intergenerational trauma is a term that is not often talked about, resulting in a lasting impact on later generations. The intergenerational transmission from trauma can come about due to an unawareness of the impact, but also the stigma that may be related to getting treatment for mental health concerns. So these are the pictures from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And what they did was they laid out little shoes, one for each child that was found. And there's also the drummers that went to the Kamloops Indian Residential School with their drums, with their songs, and with their love to help the spirits of the children, if they were there, to come home. One expert on addictions and stress, Dr. Gabor Mate, believes that the disease in an individual always tells us about the multi-generational family of origin and the broader culture in which that person's life unfolds. In other words, our grandparents and our parents' experiences affected us. For Indigenous peoples in Canada, intergenerational trauma is rooted on the opposed social and legal injustices in the form of racist, colonial, and genocidal policies, such as the Indian reservation school system and the Indian residential school system. These injustices are documented extensively in the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, among others. These reports also document the consequences of these injustices, including geographical isolation, lack of opportunities, poverty, brokenness, and poor health outcomes. This is the art of Gista Kennedy. So his interpretation is that the prayers of the people are keeping away the dysfunction and the pain of the past generations. Many Indigenous people carry significant trauma with them as a result of the violence and abuse experienced at home, passed on by parents and family members who were residential school survivors. With the lack of settlement supports and unfamiliarity with urban life, Indigenous people often ended up on the margins of society. This is more evident than in places like the downtown east side of Vancouver, where a disproportionate number of Indigenous people have ended up after leaving their home communities. Many have had to deal with and continue to deal with the trauma by using drugs and alcohol and engaging in other self-destructive behaviors which have had dire consequences, including incarceration, poor health, and even death. And this is another of the heart of Justa Kennedy and how he interprets the healing process that is starting. I believe Métis, First Nations, or Inuit writers should be more widely read because their stories they tell are fundamental motifs of Canada. Collectively, as time passes, they are building a literature of their people, found in people of Canada, and these stories need to be read and absorbed into the national consciousness because the story of Canada itself is the story of her relationship with Native people. Without these voices, the national story remains incomplete. Without these voices, the notion of history remains blue-eyed and flawed. Having all of that is incumbent on Native writers to challenge themselves to clear the literary bar by these magnificent non-Native writers of our Canadian canon. To do less is to sell short the idea of literature of people. To be read widely, a writer needs to read widely about themselves and strive to be as good as the great writers they absorb. This was Richard Wagamese. He died in March 2017 at the age of 61. He's the author of different novels of Medicine Walk, Raided Company, Him Standing, Dream Wheel, Runaway Dreams, and For Joshua, Embers, and One Native Life. Richard struggled with demons. He was open about his unhappy childhood, being fostered out more than 15 times as part of the legacy of residential schools. We can honor his spirit by educating ourselves about this time in our history, and the best way we can do that is to read his books. While we mourn the stories he has yet to tell, let us celebrate the ones he shared. He was a master, he was a story, he was love. Dear reader, dear listener, we can grieve together. Sheila Rogers, CBC. So what is Indigenous literature? Indigenous literature is any piece written by an Indigenous person. Their works are about traditions, their relationship to nature, and they experience injustice. Due to their history, a lot of Indigenous works address difficult topics and are often written really emotionally. In a statement that may apply for all Canadian Indigenous fiction, Agnes Grant in 1990 writes about the Indigenous women writers. Native literature often confronts readers with the history that is stark and unredeemable. Because of the historical treatment of Natives as callous, this may be a point of view unfamiliar to many non-Native readers. The rich diversity of contemporary Indigenous works raises many important questions. Some of these questions reflect issues regarding how Indigenous ways of being adapt colonial languages and practices to assert alternate perspectives, thereby disrupting the dominant assumptions. Due to the diversity and plurality of Indigenous cultural heritages, the multiplicity of these understandings inform and opens up contemporary writing. As Marjorie Fee argues in Upsetting Fake Identities, two important and popular novels, Jeanette Armstrong's Slash in 1985 and Beatrice Culleton Monsignor's In Search of April Raintree in 1983, actively disrupted colonial assumptions in contemporary society to expose the fake ideas and debunk the choices that white acculturation has forced upon Native people in Canada. More than 1.4 million people in Canada, or about 4% of the population, is Indigenous. There are 630 plus First Nations communities representing more than 50 nations from across the country. There are Inuit, Aboriginal people of the Arctic who live in more than 50 communities in Canada as well. So Sherry Dimeline is one of our authors who started, she wrote the book Red Rooms. She is a well-known and renowned writer of her own time now. She also did this book that won lots of prizes. It's called The Marrow Thieves. Has anybody read it? Okay, you gotta put it on your list. The Marrow Thieves is magnificent. So she says, it's imperative when we tell our stories in Indigenous contexts that we're in connection to the nations that we're speaking of, or speaking on behalf of, even in fiction. If I belong to the Métis Nation of the Georgian Bay, we used to live on Drummond Island and then were forcibly removed when the island was being annexed to the United States. To the shores of Bay from the town of, I can't even say that, Penticton, the land then become valuable as cottage country. We're 1.5 hours from Toronto with its wealthy weekenders, and we were moved again, away from the water. Now we largely reside in the French Métis town of La Fontaine, up the road on less valuable land. These removals and relocations of a culture are specific to my community. Although experienced in different ways by all Indigenous people, it's part of our stories. And it's a huge piece of why we share these stories and keep that history intact, just as we've kept our cultures intact. There must always be a connection to the nation when we tell stories. Taking a pan-Indigenous approach doesn't work. Taking colonial viewpoints doesn't work. This changes the narrative of specific nations and is highly problematic. It leads to misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and stereotypes. Indigenous literature has been gathering wider audience, and I think it has a lot to do with the readers finally having access to the beautiful stories of Indigenous people. And that has a lot to do with all publishers realizing the value and place of our stories. Sherry Dimeline. So Indigenous children's literature supports Indigenous communities' rights to revitalization and to the transmission for future generations of Indigenous histories, languages, and worldviews, as put forth in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous People. Children's literature is a means by which society transmits selective cultural understanding. Indigenous authors, illustrators, and publishers challenge Eurocentric notions of contemporary and historical Indigenous worldviews, experience, and values, as well as relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Indigenous children's literature supports Indigenous children's families and communities' rights to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their history, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures. So contemporary Indigenous children's literature created and published by Indigenous creative teams is playing a role in reclaiming, revitalizing, and sustaining Native spirituality, worldview, culture, and literacy. This is one of the little memes that I found on the internet that really hits. If we carry intergenerational trauma, and we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our genes and in our DNA. So Indigenous authors and illustrators write for Indigenous children, imagining readers who bring Indigenous perspectives and experiences within the colonial society to their reading. So Indigenous children can relate to Indigenous characters who live familiar lives and view the world from familiar perspectives. The authors, illustrators, and publishers are introducing new ways of thinking about the narrative structures and features, such as perspectives on the role of spiritual and natural worlds to children's literature. So this is one of the new books we came up with at Theytus, and it's called The Water Sings to Zoey. And Heron Hall, who is employed at the Inalkin Center, she wrote 4 of these books that explain the importance of the natural world to children. Seals the Crater is one of the books that was written by an elder, Ellen White, on the coast. We finished the book before she passed away, and it's a magnificent telling of their people's creation stories and how that can be incorporated into our modern world. Janelli's dance is basically a cute little Métis girl who's kind of ashamed at first about her jigging. Has anybody seen a jig? Okay, so it's like this really high stepping dancing. And then her kukum, she tells her, you know, just do it. This is who you are, just do it and be proud of it. And so Janelli's dance helps children realize that their cultures are valuable. It helps them feel connected. Same with the Salmon Run. It was illustrated by Clayton Gauthier, one of our students. And this was the first time that his language had been printed in over 60 years. So for 60 years, nobody had the language written into story form. And we changed that. So they need to be shared through intergenerational storytelling and picture books created by Indigenous authors who have firsthand experience or passed down stories from their parents and grandparents. This sharing can lead to a better understanding on part of Indigenous and non-Indigenous children of the intergenerational impacts of these horrific assimilative practices. So this is Inconvenient Skin by Shane Koizan. It won the Code Book Award for being in Indigenous languages. And the artwork is by an artist called Kent Miekman. And this is called The Scream. So throughout Canada, this is part of our history that the children were taken away. From Lishani is by Albert Canadian, and he explains how his life carried on from that point when they took him to the residential school to his success as a musician in the band called Chieftains. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of them. They're really good. If you get time to check it out, it's awesome. And this is Miekman Shemai by Dr. Jeanette Armstrong. So she tells the story of how these two little girls lived in the Okanagan Valley before the settlers came. So it gives a good inspiration as to what their daily lives might have been like. So for decades, our elders told us the horror stories about the residential schools, and they were laughed at. People said, get over it, and it could not have been that bad. We believed them, and we knew that writing down these stories would help the survivors and their families find some sort of peace in knowing that their testimonies would be handed down to the next generation, that the horrors would be remembered and would never be repeated upon their children and grandchildren. As painful as these stories are, they must be told in order to carry the truth forward. As of today, there have been more than 7,000 children's bodies found in unmarked graves at schools across Canada and the United States. Back home, we're just starting to do the work at the Lebret boarding school that housed my mom, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. And it's hard work. So Christian church administered boarding school systems that were established in Canada in the 1800s to forcibly remove Indigenous children from their savage parents and impose English and Christianity. Some 150,000 Indigenous children attended these schools before the last one closed in 1997. Almost every Indigenous person you know will have a residential school story, our own, our parents, our grandparents, our great-great-grandparents. Every generation in my family since the 1880s has been a victim of these schools. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Report detailed nearly 38,000 sexual and physical abuse claims from former residential school students, along with 3,200 documented deaths. The mortality rate for these children was estimated to be 5 times higher than their white counterparts due to factors including suicide, neglect, and disease. And these are the residential schools that operated across Canada. That's where Kamloops is, and my family is back over here in Lebret. Now, here's the question. Who writes the history? Is it written only by the victor? At Theytus, we allow Indigenous people to testify and share with others so that we can all learn and grow from the horrors that were suffered at the hands of the federal government. Cathartic release of emotions is the first step in healing from the horrors of the residential school system. The first step in healing is telling the truth so that the others will not get away with publishing blatant, callous lies about the history of Canada and its denial of genocide. So if you look at this, this is a book that was published in Canada about 3 years ago. And it's, it was being used in school systems across Canada. And one of the first things that gets me is the First Nations people agreed to move to different areas to make room for the new settlements. Oh shit, sorry. Excuse my language. So what we did a few years ago is sharing history. So sharing history was created in partnership with School District 67 and features the oral histories of Grace Grey Eyes, Dorothy Ward, Christinius, Pierre Kruger, and Jimmy George, as well as the writings of youth participants. Sheldon Pierre, Stiles Kruger, Montgomery, Skylar Kruger, Satin Casimir Ineas, Crispin Gabriel, Jamie Lazard, and Helena Big Eagle. So what we did was we paired them up with elders, and we sat the elders down with the young people and we said, what is an important story for you? What has to be passed down? And this is, it's a hard read to get through, so you'll have to excuse me for a second. So this is Elder Grace Grey Eyes. In 1948, I started school in Cranbrook. They sent us in the shower to the blouse was burning our heads, so they said pray, and we didn't know how to pray. We had to go to downstairs to dining room with boys on one side and girls on this side, and the grossest mush I ever had. The milk was kind of sour, and they brought boys in with sheets on their heads. They wet the bed, and this was the humiliation. The little boys were crying, and Rita Jacobs, my friend, she was deaf on one side because they hit her ear and they broke her eardrum, and it was bleeding. I was there for 8 years, and it was like prison. One nun, she was a giant. If you didn't learn, you got strapped, and she used a long ruler, and they say, put your hands up. She has a whip, and she whipped me, and I wouldn't cry. She quit. Next day, my back was all covered in welts, and they soaked in a bathtub with salt water. It sure helped. We were called an industrial school. We went to school in the morning and worked all afternoon, and I was there for a whole 10 years, and they worked the hell out of us. In 1957, I left the school, and that is the last picture of Grace and her brother. She was not allowed to talk to, even though he was in the same school. So it took them almost 12 years before they could talk again. And that was the picture taking before they put her on the cattle car at the church to go to the residential school. At the PIB church, there was this big truck there. Dad said, you go in the big truck. So me and my brother got on a big cattle truck and went from Penticton Indian Band to West Bay, and then to Vernon. We got to Kamloops Indian Residential School, and the truck was full of children. The younger ones had wet themselves, and it took all day to get there. The boys and girls were separated, and she yelled, no, no, I don't want to leave my brother. The big girls were separated from the little girls. They ate, and then they went to sleep. There were rows and rows of beds of girls, and we heard a loud bell in the morning. The nuns knelt down beside the beds and prayed. Everyone got up and went to the showers, and then they got their hair cut short like boys' hairs. At first I said, no, you're not touching my hair. Then we had to go to church and mass and prayed, and we had a hard time understanding English. I was so happy to come home. I still didn't know how old I was, but I knew my name was Caroline. I met Joey one summer when we were playing ball. We went to school for 6 years up until grade 5. Joey was tall and handsome. He had black hair, and Dad took me to Peach Fest and rodeo parade. I met Joey at the carnival grounds. I was a teenager then, and he rode a horse in the parade. After the parade, we went to the carnival festival, and I saw Joey and he asked, are you going back to Kamloops? I told him I was. I guess they had a meeting about me at the school because I was a troublemaker, so I left. We got to Oliver at 3 a.m. My brother was sleeping in my bedroom, so I slept in the living room. When I got up the next morning, there was no running water and no electricity. Dad said we had to go to Oregon and told me to stay with the little kids. I said, that's fine. My bro said, I'm riding over the hills, going to play pool. I said, if you see Joey, can you tell him I'm home? I put the kids to bed and went to bed, and all of a sudden I hear, hey sis, you got a match to light the fire? He lights a match and I look, holy smoke, who is with him? Joey. He ran over to my bed and I fell onto his lap and he said, you made it home. And I said, yeah, I made it home. Joey never left me. We were married, and for 61 years we were married. So that's them on their wedding day. And it's like one of those cute love stories that you hear and you're like, I don't want the feels. So this is the response from one of the students, Satin Casimir Inias. So hearing Grandma Grace's story of when she was growing up until now was filled with joy, happiness, and heartbreak, and anger for what she had to go through. I'm very proud to have such strong women in our community. Hearing that she was beaten like that broke my heart, but it also made my heart grow when she stood up for herself and having the courage not to beat the nun, even though she could have gone down their road. It was amazing and it blew my mind. What I remember from my workshop with the elders was my Grandma Grace and Grandma Carolyn Pierre. They shared their family history. My grandma told a story about her experience in residential school, and one of the details when my grandma and her friend ran out from the Cranbrook Residential School when she was about 12 or 13 years old. Then they got found a few days later with her friends. It's so important for the youth to know about the history of the elders so they can help keep the knowledge and pass it down to future generations to come. So this is one of the stories from the Behind Closed Doors, the Kamloops Indian Residential School book. So long before Europeans arrived in this country, the Aboriginal people had their own spiritual beliefs. The people believed that everything in nature had a purpose and a meaning. Storytelling was used to teach many lessons of life. The mythical transformer Coyote was the central figure of many of these stories. Each Coyote story explained some aspect of nature or some portion of how the world had been created. Each story had a moral, instructing the Shishwamic how to live in harmony with nature and with each other. Traditionally, elders and parents recognized the child's potential and helped shape the child towards adulthood. Growing up was a natural process, and the children were taught skills to help their families survive. Over time, the children then became a productive member of their community.
Oh, I'm fooling around.
Oh, and then we'll pause there momentarily. Okay, so however, in the early 1800s, Aboriginal people were crushed by epidemics and the influx of the newcomers during the gold rush. By 1862, the diseases had reduced the Shishwamic to a minority in their own lands. The Catholic missionaries arrived in Kamloops in 1842. At first, they only wanted to convert the people to Christianity. The missionaries learned the language and translated the new religious teachings into Shishwamic language. During this time, the federal government developed the assimilation policy, which stated that all First Nations had to give up all aspects of their life and culture and adopt white society. The missionaries and the federal government decided to establish residential schools where the children would be forced to live for long periods of time without seeing their parents. Discipline was very strict. Any practice in traditional beliefs or using one's Aboriginal languages was quickly punished. The goal of the school was to make Aboriginal people laborers and semi-skilled tradesmen. A high-quality academic education was deemed unnecessary. Restriction to an elementary education for 80 years denied Aboriginal people from realizing their full potential. It wasn't until 1952 that the school actually produced high school graduates. The missionaries had complete control over the children, and the absolute power often led to physical and sexual abuses. Today, former students have found the strength to bring out the truth and to begin their healing process. Historically, Coyote had to face many dangers and challenges. Often he was injured or even killed, but he always came back to life. In the same way, the Aboriginal people have had their traditional ways tested. For over 100 years, people have been oppressed But today, like the coyote, they've returned to life. Like in the traditional times, the people are using storytelling to educate and to heal. The real strength as survivors of a residential school can be found in their stories. So the dedication of Behind Closed Doors. This book is a true testament of the events that took place at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. It was behind closed doors. The storytellers as children experienced mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical abuse and trauma. These stories that speak of that trauma. There are many survivors out there, and more have lost their lives as the direct or indirect action of the school. While attending residential school, the children felt hunger, not only for food, but for love and comfort from their mothers and fathers, their grandparents, aunts and uncles, and even from their brothers and sisters. This book is dedicated to the numerous individuals who have lost their lives either while attending the school or during the years following up to the present. As we read these stories, we can only begin to understand the loneliness and despair these individuals live with every day of their lives. With sharing these stories, we sincerely hope that their spirits will find peace. So these warriors are survived and are now giving voice to thousands of children who died feeling that they did something wrong because their parents had to abandon them to this horrible place called residential schools. So even if they aged out, their children would be taken from them as well. So these storytellers give voice to the thousands emotional pain from their abusers and who died slow or violent deaths because of their addictions. These storytellers, as in our tradition, will help the next generation to understand the pain and suffering of the generations who attended the residential schools. These storytellers will give a voice to the thousands of elders who lost their role as the teachers of their language, culture, and traditions. These storytellers will give voice to the parents who suffered tremendous guilt because they could not protect their children from harm. These storytellers will give voice to thousands who are not allowed to be children and who are told to hold on to their innocence. These storytellers give hope to thousands of children who are now in the care of provincial institutions throughout Canada by making sense of why their parents did not know how to be parents. We're on the threshold of a new beginning where we are in control of our own destinies. We must be careful and listen to the voices that have been silenced by fear and isolation. We must be careful to not repeat the patterns or create an oppressive system of the residential schools. We must build an understanding of what happened to these generations that came before us. As survivors, we must experience the feelings in a safe and therapeutic environment. We develop a thriving attitude and not a victim mentality. We must begin to experience life with all its natural stresses and joys. When we say that, children are our future, and the future is now. So we have seen the future, and it's Indigenous. The mandate of Theytus is to hand down for future generations, a task that we have always taken to heart. One of the first books made by Theytus was We Get Our Living Like Milk from the Land. It's the first historical overview of the Okanagan Nation. It starts with the creation story and moves through the first contact of colonization and ends in the present times. This book brings forth the truth of Indigenous history. This book shows children how the world was before and how the world changes the lives of the Silk people. The following excerpt is about the sacredness of children and the roles and responsibilities in raising a child. So babies up until age 3 were always accompanied by one member of their family. They worked together and helped each other to feed and care for them. There was never a need for babysitters and leaving the children with strangers. Within the family unit, the grandparents watched over the children between the ages of 4 to 11. Their role was to educate and discipline the children in a patient, loving way. These children grew up to be happy, gentle people. It was good for the grandparents and the children and their parents. Teens and young adults accompanied older aunts and uncles to be trained by them in special work. Children were taught from the time they could learn. Skills such as fishing, hunting, tanning hides, and making baskets were taught with great patience. By the time the child was grown, he or she had always had what they needed to take full part in their community. Harshness was not used in teaching children. Learning was always made very easy at first. It gradually became harder, but only as much as the child could do well at. There was no such thing as failure. Teaching them through success opened up the child at a very young age to being good at things. They were then ready to do harder things later without fear of failing. Children found out what not to do through a sense of learning, to be responsible to their family teachers. It is a silk law to teach that each person is responsible to the rest of the people, to be a healthy part of the whole family and community. Adults are responsible to teach about this at an early age by slowly, very clearly, how our actions are always tied to others and how some actions disappoint and hurt their teachers and family, the people they love the most. By the time the child became an adult, he knew how to respect others and how to live within the family unit, the extended family, the community, and the nation as a whole. This is good governance and the laws of the silk as a people. There was no such thing as an orphan because the whole family, not only the direct parents, were responsible to teach, love, and provide for the children. Each person then had a right, even unborn, to a family, to teaching, and to security, and to love. No one can be left out. This is good governance because all silk are important and must be cared for. One of the most outstanding laws of the silk is to learn to live and work in harmony with everyone and share everything within the community. We were taught in the Chaptique story of Turtle that we must not only think of ourselves as individuals, we were taught that having more than others has to do with power and control of others. We were taught that it's wrong to have more things while others go without in your community or family. Wealth is to be enjoyed in times of plenty, and hardship is to be faced by all in bad times. The people stay strong together that way, and it is good governance. Another law that every person shared equally in the work and benefits. The highest form of good government is one in which all members are healthy, housed, and protected. In such a society, there is no need for enforcement of laws because people don't steal from each other. Real self-government means all the people govern themselves without enforcement. Good government to the silk means that we carry the laws inside of us. It means we know how to act and live right without having someone to force us. The silk people were masters at civilization in that way. We know those that do not know these simple laws are savage, barbaric, and uncivilized. We call such people wild men because they are lawless. The silk had no schools, judges, or police. The children never went hungry when they were part of a village. Rape or child abuse was unknown. People were strong and lived to be old and were free in their lives. Gathering food, everyday work was shared, and there were lots of time to spend on creative and interesting things. The silk were great storytellers, artists, crafters, thinkers, singers, and musicians. They were best natural scientists and doctors. They excelled at sports and were extensive travelers. Art history shows all of this. This is the new sculpture by Clint George that's going to be at the Okanagan College. This is Sheldon Louis' artwork. And then this is one of the really nice murals that is up in Kelowna right now. So when we started over 40 years ago, we were the only one. We were all alone. Now we're bursting with pride as other presses have grown and are telling other people's stories as well. So these are just some of the books that I would recommend if you want to get reading, and they're good ones to start. 5 Little Indians, it's gonna make you cry. In My Own Moccasins, I literally went through 2 boxes of tissues just to get through it. Mamaskat, it's his story of what happened to him. Tanya Tagak, she is an amazing woman. If you read Split Tooth, it's dark, but it's so worth it. Moon of the Crusted Snow is Wapijik Rice. He started with Theytus Books, and it's an amazing apocalyptic story. Seven Fallen Feathers is by Tanya, and she really takes her time to explain the mechanisms of society and how we're unpacking from that. Non-coping mechanisms by Mr. Ray Belcourt is exquisite. Empire of the Wild, that is the new one by Sherry Dimeline, and that's where she actually goes into some of the darker mythology. There's one, it's almost like a werewolf, it's called Rigamaru. And she uses that mythology in modern times. It's pretty good. So we have our children's books, our board books with languages that were almost eradicated. The stories of our elders, our communities, our people, our cultures, and most important, our very survival as Indigenous people with Turtle Island. These stories, histories, and languages now can be passed down to future generations because they were written down. We published the stories of a time when the value of them was seen as quaint recollections of dying races. Here we are in 2021, surviving and thriving, still sharing our knowledge and hope that we can make a better path forward for our children. Creating books so our languages can be learned and spoken once again on the land of our ancestors. Creating new digital materials that can use new technologies to preserve our ways and traditions. If we can change the way our children think about themselves, we can change the world. Representation matters. To see one's own reflection in the media is uplifting, and to hear our histories from our elders is a gift. So Theytus means to preserve for the sake of handing down. That is our mission, our history, and our privilege. To share the stories, histories, and the beauty of our cultures with you. Lim.
Like, it's so hefty sometimes. Like, I finish shaking and I'm like, I'm okay.
But yeah, that's pretty much why it's really important to me to make these books for future generations, for kids to understand what happened, for kids to know what's happening, for the transmission of knowledge from one generation to another. Whereas we had storytelling, and we would tell those stories and everybody would learn at the same time. When we were removed from those traditional ways, we needed to make new ways forward. And I think that's one of the gifts that I've been given in my life, is the ability to share these stories with people, to help other writers develop their voice, for people to become known in a wider audience, and for the power of those stories to exist, even though we were almost eradicated, we were beaten, everything bad that could happen, there's still little kids that are reading the language and saying those words and learning the history of their people. And that's, for me, the greatest thing. But any questions? Yeah.
Why? Can you teach us the word for thank you?
Lim. That is the word for thank you, sorry. Lim is thank you in the Silk language. But Lim, yep.
Thank you.
And there's also classes online at the Acknowledgment Center if you wanted to take like the first level in Silchin, which is basic, Lim. And then everybody knows why. So if you see a Silk person, you're gonna say, why? First thing, it'll freak them out. It's awesome. Any other questions? No? Pretty much horrified everybody. It's okay? No?
It's such a hard story to listen to, and it must be like you say, hard for you to tell us. wondering if you get support after the storage and present this.
Well, that's kind of one of the things. It's like we have to learn, like my generation has to learn how to deal with this and how to formulate plans to take care of ourselves. Because basically all we are is energy in this little form, and we have to take care of it while we're here. So for me, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go home, I'm gonna listen to music really loud, I'm gonna dance like an idiot, and it's gonna make me feel good. You know, it's a personal choice how people deal with it, right? Because it's such a heavy thing to carry all the time. And it's such a heavy thing to explain all the time. So I feel it's a lot better that we have the resources that we have, so we can go, here you go, you read this, right? Instead of having to re-explain what's been happening all the time. But yeah, that's just what I do. And then I've also brought some of Theytus Books. Yay! We have this new book that's amazing. It actually took almost 7 years of research for Jeanette Armstrong and her 2 compatriots to actually put it together. It's called Okanagan Women's Voices. So what they did was they went in the history books, the archives, the museums, all the collections, and they found 7 women, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And it's about the history of here in the Okanagan, because a lot of history gets forgotten. And these voices and these stories would have been lost. Like, they wouldn't have mattered. And they do matter. All our stories matter. Every person's life story has a different path and a way that creates connections. You don't even know about it until the person's gone. But it's an amazing book, and she includes the different chaptiques of the area. And it's, if you've been in Penticton for a while, you'll know the family names. So I'm really proud of this new book that we have, and I'm really proud of Theytus, because it's not just me. I've only been there for like 10 years. So, oh, Jesus, sorry. I've only been here for like 12 years. And the people that came before me, like Greg Younging, Lee Miracle, Jeanette Armstrong, they all had such an important role and position in keeping this knowledge and keeping what happened in book form, so that we can easily transmit it to other people, so that we create a better understanding of the world. And that for me is like awesome. Like, it's no better than that for me. Okay, I'm joking. If I won the lottery, it would be better. Any other questions? No? Yep.
Just wanted to thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you.
And the work that you have for this topic is very, very good.
Thank you.
And I have a huge impact on me. So thank you very, very much for giving us the depth.
Thank you. Oh, that's the thing, right? We're dealing with the past, and the past is not always pretty. But the thing that drives me as a driving force is that these are stories that need to be told and shared with people. And even if it puts me out of my comfort zone, like I'm gonna crank up the music tonight. Even if it puts me out of my comfort zone, at least I know that I'm doing my job for my people. So it's worth it. But I'm sorry I bummed everybody out. I know it's kind of a heavy topic. I myself try not to cry. I'm like, no, it's good, I can deal with it. But the truth needs to be known, and that's the only way we can heal for our children in the future, right? Like, I have 2 daughters that are amazing human beings, right? And I was lucky enough that I could teach them our ways, and I could teach them our history, and it's made them invincible. So I think it's worth it to get in the dirt. Like, it's not always a clean process, almost like a scab, you have to pull the scab off before we heal. So that's what I'm hoping our books do for you guys. And I'm hoping that you guys go check out the library, check out this one. This is awesome. Yeah, but thank you very much for taking your time out of your day and for listening to me. And I hope you guys pick up a good book. It doesn't have to be Theytus, but pick up a good book. All right.
Today's from that. Before you leave, a couple things. I'd just like to thank you all for your donations and let you know that next week we'll be having Ethel Laura. She's going to speak about Kathleen Ellis of the Ellis Pioneer family. And Kathleen Ellis is career nurse, so that'll be next week. Thanks again. Thanks very much.